I'm Greg Nigh. I'm a naturopathic doctor and acupuncturist. And I'm here today, primarily I'm going to talk about a protocol that we have developed and are using in our clinic, and I'm going to explain what that is. But I'm going to start by giving you some thoughts about why the protocol works. And this has to do with the fact that discovering this relationship between sulfur and some really intense pathology that we were seeing in the clinic, and kind of unlocking that and seeing these amazing transformations in health that were happening, and then trying to understand why would this be? And it has to do with the relationship between sulfur and water. And I think, not just me, but some other people think too. And so I want to just sort of go through that because I think it has some bearing on some other things we've talked about here. So I'm just going to run through a set of what I just call some propositions, because it makes sense and it's based on some good underlying science, but it's sort of trying to put together how water disruption in the body, and of course this is the organized water, the easy water, leads to pathology. So biological water forms easy structures when it runs up against these hydrophilic surfaces. And so our bodies are filled with hydrophilic surfaces, just as is found in these other kind of experiments. These surfaces, which are cells and epithelial and connective tissue, they are maintained as strongly hydrophilic because of the presence of sulfur-dense molecules and these glycosaminoglycans, which I'll explain a little bit more as we go. And the maintenance of these EZs, as we know, is critical for protein folding, for DNA transcription, ion transport, cell-to-cell communication, the breakdown of which leads to things like cancer, and also information distribution around the body. And of course, my belief is that information is the key currency that we're dealing with, and water has to be maintained in that organized form for the adequate transmission of information around the body in a flash, right? It's through electromagnetics, essentially. So the thing is, nature did something really smart, and that is to line every cell, every surface, everything in the body is lined with the most negatively charged molecule in all of biology. It's heparan sulfate, which it's an extremely negative charge. And so of all the possibilities that it could be, that's the one that lines the cells, lines the epithelia, everything. And so I picture it heparan sulfate stands like this Christmas tree on the surface of everything, and the water falls into place around it in its nice structured form, maintaining that easy layer over all of it, which is critical. The problem with this is that sulfur has this dual role. One is that it as heparan sulfate and chondroitin sulfate and lots of other sulfated forms, it's out there in the body doing its thing. Over here in the liver, it's involved in detoxification, phase 2 detox. Sulfation is a major way that things get detoxified and move out of the body because sulfur binds. It's a chelator. You look up any chelating agents, where if you want to get mercury, you want to get mercury out, you want to get lead out, you want to get heavy metals out of the body, you use sulfur because it binds that stuff. It'll bind organochlorides, it binds all kinds of things. So you can kind of see where this is going. And I just wanted to, I guess, let me see, this is maybe, there we go. So these are just some evidence that some people have already talked about how the structured water lines things like the vessels and I found this recently that using a bright field, it gives a width on a capillary here, but then when they use a different imaging technique, the width gets much smaller, and you can see along the sides here is the exclusion zone, that it's excluding dextran that is used as a dye in there. So the exclusion zone is lining all of these vessels. And I also found this interesting, just yesterday came across this article where they were using this photobiomodulation, which is the use of a cold laser, which is sort of the laser is carried on the back of an audio wave to get a deeper penetration. And they were using MRI to see that it actually was expanding the thickness of the EZ around in tumors following successful therapy. That they could monitor changes in response to therapy by changes in the EZ, which I thought was quite interesting. And they're suggesting that this is going to be a way of knowing about response to the various therapies. And I'm not going to read through all this, but just some more, some citations here about changes in sulfate, inorganic sulfate. If you don't have adequate access to inorganic sulfate, which is the goal, the body has to get to sulfate, because sulfate is used not only for building these proteoglycans, but sulfate gets latched onto all the hormones, right? And we think of them, I mean, it's considered that once a hormone is sulfated, it is no longer active. It's not, you know, that's the inactive form of the hormone. But in fact, I think it makes much more sense, the work of Stephanie Seneff, who pointed this out, that sulfate in the hormones is just a way of trafficking sulfate around the body. It gets distributed that way. The pineal gland sulfates melatonin in the brain, and that allows sulfate to get transferred around the brain, and all the sulfated DHEA and estrogen, they're all sulfated. Vitamin D is sulfated. When it's not sulfated, it doesn't do nearly the wide range of things as it does in the sulfated form. Also, heparin sulfate on the cell surface is a co-receptor for many, many things. And if you, so for instance, I just pointed out one here that it plays a role in the activation of interferon and starting a whole cytokine cascade, part of the inflammatory response. So when heparin sulfate when it gets interfered with, it interferes with all kinds of things. It not only changes the structure of the water, but it interferes with all kinds of binding of things that need it at the cell surface doing what it needs to do. So when xenobiotics, which are, you know, just all the metals and things, the stuff that we get exposed to, when it binds sulfur or sialic acid, which is another it's a negative charge that sits on the surface of cells, there's supposed to be a sort of a healthy amount, and things like cancer cells accumulate lots of sialic acid to get a very strongly negative surface charge. So when xenobiotics bind to these things on heparin sulfate proteoglycans outside of standard phase 2, so sulfur over there is supposed to bind things, but sulfur over here, organized in water, is not supposed to bind things. The local EZ is reduced or destroyed, and that has all kinds of consequences. Aluminum binds to transferrin, lead and mercury bind to many serum proteins and sialic acid, binds to albumin and gets carried all around the body. Glyphosate, active ingredient in Roundup and other herbicides now, it binds to many of these metals, which are in fact crucial both for heme synthesis, and we'll come back to that, and also to molybdenum, which is crucial for sulfate processing in the body. Most heavy metals bind sulfur, so sulfur binds to just an amazing number of things. And glyphosate impairs sulfate synthesis and utilization. Glyphosate is a big deal. It's the most widely used herbicide on the planet, and we're all exposed whether we're eating organic or not, and it's just amazing how prevalent glyphosate is. It's something we do test glyphosate in our clinic just to see the levels that people have. Halides can displace sulfur metabolizing enzymes or inhibit enzyme function. And what happens, this is mainly an enzyme called sulfite oxidase, which converts sulfite, which is highly reactive in the body, to sulfate, and has a molybdenum core. It's a enzyme. So you have to be able to build heme, and remember that glyphosate impairs heme production. So not only will it cause anemia with chronic exposure, but all heme enzymes get hit. All the cytochrome P450 enzymes and phase 1 metabolism in the liver are heme enzymes. So if you impair that, if you displace the iron as aluminum does, you impair heme function. If you impair heme production, or with this particular, with the sulfite oxidase enzyme, it's not iron, it's molybdenum. And halides, so bromine, and those things will displace the molybdenum and will shut down the function of that. So either way, if you have not enough heme or you interfere with the function of the enzyme, you build up sulfite, which is very reactive in the body. I mean, that is symptomatic with sulfite. It has to get to sulfate, which is where the body's trying to get to. I've got a lot of problems. Glyphosate, we've already talked about this. Suox is a heme enzyme. Those enzymes are inhibited. Glyphosate is a strong cosmotrope, and so this was mentioned in cosmotrope, chaotrope was mentioned in the last presentation as well. Cosmotrope's having more of a gelling effect on the blood, or increasing the viscosity, and the body has a very, very precise regulation on the amount of sulfate in the blood that is likely a way that the body maintains blood viscosity. And so if anything comes into circulation that is also a strong cosmotrope, then we have problems, because then sulfate moving in the blood will overgel things. And so glyphosate is a very strong cosmotrope, as is aluminum, and a lot of other toxic things are cosmotropes. And so those will increase the viscosity of the blood, and it kind of, the body has to figure out different ways of moving sulfate, because if it moves it in the normal pathways, it will overgel the blood. Impaired sulfur metabolism leads to the growth of sulfur-fixing bacteria. And those bacteria will produce sulfite and hydrogen sulfide, which are both very symptomatic if they're in excess. Hydrogen sulfide is important for lots of things, but when it's in excess, it's a significant problem and can be quite dramatic in the symptoms that are associated with hydrogen sulfide. It's also, it is a gasotransmitter. It's active in the brain, so it diffuses into the blood as a gas, moves around the body. It is, if it stays in the gut, it is associated with the inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and irritable bowel. Once into the bloodstream, it is reactive throughout the body. It can lead to joint pain, can lead to anxiety and brain fog and all kinds of things, and we'll talk about that a little more. But consider, so this is overgrowth of the sulfur-fixing bacteria. Mostly desulfovibrio is the class that's the main one that gets produced, which we think about dysbiosis, meaning gut messed up, as being a problem, but it's possibly the body's compensation for an inability to move sulfate in its normal pathways. If you can't move sulfate as sulfate, because that would overgel, essentially, then you have to repackage it in a way that it can get out to the periphery to get converted to sulfate there. So both sulfite and hydrogen sulfide can be converted through direct mitochondria oxidation to sulfate. So possibly that overgrowth of what we call the pathogenic bacteria is in fact a clever way of the body to get sulfate moved around. Anyway, that's just a possibility. And so I just mentioned hydrogen sulfide, and also it converts to sulfite. So those two can interconvert. And there are alternative pathways to PAPs, which is the active form of sulfate in the body that gets attached to cholesterol. cholesterol sulfate is absolutely essential. The body has to be able to generate cholesterol sulfate, and if it can't, it will forms all kinds of bad things. So we have this problem that sulfur has gotten messed up in the body. We get exposed to all kinds of things in modern life that bind to sulfate, not just in phase 2 detox, but distributed throughout the body where it's playing its role in organizing water and doing those great things that are necessary for the maintenance of health. Another problem, so there's that binding that interrupts those functions. Also in the gut, there's a problem. So sulfur metabolism gets clogged, either as compensation or as part of a pathological process. We end up with a generation of hydrogen sulfide and sulfite. Hydrogen sulfide is associated with a whole wide range of chronic diseases. Sulfite, same thing. Hydrogen sulfide is a vasodilator, and so it's not uncommon that people come in that we figure out have this issue going on. And they're dealing with one of the main problems, they end up with low blood pressure. They get all woozy when they stand up, and chronically low blood pressure, which is you don't see as often, but they can be quite tachycardia, and heart arrhythmias is not uncommon at all. Skin issues are huge with sulfate, and so I'll talk about these a little more because I'll talk about the clinical stuff. But related issues. So because these proteoglycans it is our connective tissue. Our connective tissue is loaded with sulfur. It's so widely distributed, and connective tissue itself has it's just amazingly organized. It is not a mesh, really. It has a very intricate three-dimensional structure. And so if we mess up sulfur there, it is messing up not just water, but really the whole structure. And so connective tissue disorders, which can range from hypermobile joints. People have problems, with all kinds of joint stuff, whether it's inflammatory joint stuff or just chronic sprains and things like that. Fatigue is huge. Fatigue and brain fog are big deal. And of course, we heard a lot of talk, I guess, about the battery function of water, and certainly in the body. If heparan sulfate gets messed up and the water structure falls, then that's an energy source that we have lost. And so we would expect, if in fact it's true that we're losing water structure through this process, fatigue would be expected as part of that, because that is usable energy for the body. Chemical sensitivities, because glutathione, so keeping in mind glutathione, which is like the godfather of antioxidants and detoxifiers in the body. It's hugely important. And it is a sulfur molecule, of course. And so if sulfur metabolism has messed up, then a consequence of that is an impaired production of glutathione. And that can lead to a whole big range of things, from excess free radicals and buildup of heavy metals and lots of things. Chemical sensitivities, because glutathione is so important with that. And also, the GABA receptor, this has to do with heparan sulfate being part of that process. With the GABA receptor, when GABA receptor gets messed up, it is also associated, clinically, it's been associated with chemical sensitivities. And in fact, one of the problems with people who come off of the benzo drugs that are having an effect on the GABA receptor, they can have quite dramatic increase in chemical sensitivities, like really big increases when they try to come off. So messing up that, it's all tied in together. Histamine, I'm trying to give an idea of the range of things that can be associated with this messed up sulfur thing in the heparan sulfate, because histamine, for example, so to degrade histamine, the enzyme that does that, the amine oxidase, it requires a kind of this co-receptor function thing with heparan sulfate. And so it's like in so many ways that if you mess up heparan sulfate, then you're going to mess up lots and lots of processes in the body, and each one of those is going to have its manifestation once things are out of balance enough. So, distilling. So we have xenobiotics, and they come in and they find sulfur, and that messes up water, and that corrupts information and communication between and among cells, and heparan sulfate, in fact, links the extracellular matrix to the internal of the cell. So, there are these proteins, fibronectin, for example, which spans from the outside and plunges to the interior of the cell and is important for the cell understanding where it is in the body, right? It tells the cell you are a lung cell, right? I mean, not just fibronectin, there are some others that, really these cables go plunge into the cell and they let the cell know where it is. And heparan sulfate is integral in that process. And so if there is a disruption, then cells kind of lose their orientation of where they are and what they're supposed to do. So then, so we kind of stumble. When I say we, Maria is here with me, and she's a nutrition therapist in the clinic, and we work together, and we kind of stumbled upon this because I was doing my geeky stuff, just studying sulfur, and like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe all this stuff about sulfur. And then she was working with patients. She's certified to do what's called a GAPS diet, which is a diet that's used for autistic kids and some other people with mental and emotional kinds of problems. And she was finding that there was a subset of people who would go on that diet and they would do great for a period of time and then crash really, really hard. And which was a mystery. And when they crashed, it would be a hard crash and they couldn't come out of it. And they would stay on the diet thinking that, well, I just gotta stick with the diet. And so she was having that work with her patients, and then I was over here working, just talking with people about sulfur, and she kind of actually overheard the telephone conversation I was having with one of the researchers who's doing the sulfur work, and it started clicking in her head that, wait a minute, this GAPS diet is loaded with sulfur. It's a very, very high sulfur diet. And so from that, we started moving into this process of how can we maybe figure out a protocol to see if it would work with getting these people who are not doing well on high sulfur diets. Would it change if we try to unlock this sulfur thing? So that was the beginning. And so what I'm going to now move into is kind of telling you what that came to be. We developed a protocol, and still developing it in many ways, which has been sort of amazing. Not with everybody. Not everybody has a sulfur problem. Sulfur, I should have started in the beginning to say it's exquisitely important for health. We have to have sulfur. We're not in any way saying that sulfur shouldn't be part of a diet. The problem is just that some people get locked up in their sulfur metabolism. And until that gets unlocked, then you can't, at least I hadn't been able to get their health taken care of. Before I knew about this whole sulfur thing, I would try all that other stuff that you try, with various nutrients and detox therapies and whatever, but until we got sulfur figured out, there was that subset of people that we just couldn't do anything for. So, so to get into exactly what it is that we're doing with people in the clinic, of course we start out in the intake and trying to figure out, is this really a sulfur issue? Like, do we need to start their treatment process with sulfur and sort of our sulfur protocol? So some questions that we are asking everybody who comes in, and really we have a certain picture of the people that have sulfur problems, but we have been sort of amazed at how many people have responded to this protocol that we never would have guessed that sulfur would have been an issue. But we just, sometimes if we can't think of anything else, we just try it, and it's like, whoa, and it can be amazing. So the questions that we ask, we want to know if they react to sulfur drugs. Exaggerated symptoms with wine. It's pretty well known that wine has sulfites. Wine is a pretty big exposure. Oddly enough, Maria pointed out to me that she saw that white wine is actually higher sulfites than red wine, pretty significantly so. People tend to think about having problems with red wine, but both are high sulfur. A major issue has to do with the amount of garlic, onions, eggs, and broccoli, and I'll give you some more other ideas about the dietary stuff, but of course these are what we think of as healthy foods. And in fact, I have patients come in and they're taking enormous amounts of garlic in their diet, and they're taking supplements of garlic, and sometimes feeling terrible, but taking it thinking that that's part of what's going to get them healthier. And in fact, there have been a few cases where Maria has done almost nothing more than just getting them to stop eating garlic. And it's amazing what that one change has done for some people. Really incredible. So we need to get an idea of, are they eating a diet that is really, really high in sulfur? And many people are, because now people are cramming greens into their smoothies every day, right? Kale and we're eating so much more sulfur now than we used to, because now we have it year round. It's not a seasonal thing that we can put kale in our smoothie. We can do it every day. So there's lots of dietary sulfur coming in. We want to know about waking with headaches, because that has something that we have seen as a common thing. And one of the really amazing things, we actually still are thinking we might have found a cure for menopausal hot flashes, which it's just amazing how many women menopausal telling us that they have just lots and lots of hot flashes and they're miserable. I remember one saying 30 a day, and she's just constantly one after the other. And we go through this process, just sulfur. All we're dealing with is sulfur. And hot flashes can reduce to 0. Not everybody, but if not to 0, it is very commonly a dramatic reduction. Sulfur is very hot, so symptoms associated with heat are a big deal. Skin, but not always skin, but very commonly. So dermatitis and rashes and things like that, hives, hot flashes, flushing, sweats, just volcanoes. Think about volcanoes. So things that erupt, and cystic acne and things like that. Brain fog, anxiety. Brain fog is big, and I think that's hydrogen sulfide because it's associated with that. And then gut stuff, inflammatory bowel, from mild to extreme. Sometimes, we have worked with some people with really intense colitis and ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease who have responded just amazingly to the sulfur protocol. So we used to call it the LSD, but that was a bad thing to chart, that I was having people do the low sulfur diet. So we made it the low sulfur protocol, because that looks better on the chart. We have to reduce the intake and speed the outflow. I do things like check genomics, and so I don't place too much influence on this. CBS is the gateway between, it's kind of down the sulfur pathway, and there can be some upregulations in that. I think SUOX is probably a big deal. That's a sulfide oxidase, and there are some, especially if someone is homozygous on SUOX, I think it's a pretty big deal because they are significantly impaired in converting sulfite to sulfate. I have to check serum homocysteine because homocysteine is a source of sulfate. Homocysteine gets converted to homocysteine lactone, and from there it can be turned into sulfate. And so potentially elevated homocysteine is another compensatory thing if the body can't get to sulfate otherwise. There's a whole list of supplements that we are using with people, and I've just put here some of the effects that they have. We commonly are using hydroxycobalamin. There's a particular form of vitamin B12 because it lowers serum hydrogen sulfide. Capsaicin can be good for pain relief, people that are having a lot of pain associated with it. Butyrate we commonly use because it blocks the effects of hydrogen sulfide in the gut, and so it can reduce inflammation in the gut. Molybdenum is for essentially everybody, and we learned early on that we have to be kind of careful because it can really start moving things very fast, and when we would start people on significant doses of molybdenum, it would sometimes could trigger what we would call sulfur dump, because we didn't know what else to call it, but just a huge amount of, like, people get really inflamed and rashes and mattitis and things. So some others here, think lemongrass, it will kill the sulfur-fixing bacteria in the gut. So just depending on the case, we kind of would pick the supplements that seem most appropriate. The diet, we have to reduce dietary sulfur, which includes not just the, of course, garlic and those sort of things, but also, at least initially, meat, milk, cheese, because those have lots of cysteine and methionine, which are the amino acids that various bacteria can convert to sulfite and hydrogen sulfide. So we have to reduce all that, especially garlic, the dark greens I talked about. We have to get people involved in detox therapies. So we're doing infrared saunas because, as people have mentioned, infrared really helps to build up the EZ, and we feel that is critical. And there are a number of metals and chemicals that come out in much, much higher concentrations in the sweat than they move through the blood or the bowels. So sweat is a very important detoxification with the infrared added for the battery. Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate, that's a way of delivering sulfate into the blood, and you bypass the gut. And so we have people do those, and it's quite rare that someone would has a reaction to an Epsom salt bath. And I think that's a very different kind of problem. That's more of an allergic response. Most people do quite well with Epsom salt baths, and in fact, doing them regularly will increase sulfite in the blood very consistently up to a point, and then it's like the body has a storage of sulfate that it needs, and then doing more baths, it won't raise the blood levels anymore. It keeps it steady. So Epsom salt baths are important. We're using homeopathic remedies and drainage remedies, which are another kind of homeopathic. And it had been using homeopathic sulfur and tried that a few times, and I would think, it would make sense that would work, but in fact we had people just get super exacerbated when we would give them homeopathic sulfur. It really made them intensely worse. I don't know, with homeopathics, we were using either 6C or 30C doses, and at both levels, pretty much every time we would give it, it would make people quite bad, so we sort of stopped doing that. And also just to note that homeopathics or no, not that if you go to any health food store, the detox supplements are loaded with sulfur. I mean, all, you know, the MSM and the NAC and lipoic acid and methionine, they're all detox, but they're heavy sulfur. So we had to do detox without all the sulfur. So anyway, I see my time's up. So that is just an overview of the process, and it has been transformative for some people, and I think it all has to do with sulfur and